Well, welcome everyone to the October Chicago in Focus, a series of talks put on by the League of Women Voters of Chicago and the Union League Club of Chicago. My name is Catherine Mardykes, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the League of Women Voters of Chicago. Before we get started, just a few words about our two organizations. Founded more than 140 years ago, the Union League Club of Chicago emerged from the Union Leagues of America, an organization created to support President Lincoln's Union. Since its founding, the club has upheld the sacred obligations of citizenship, has promoted honesty and efficiency in government, and supported our cultural institutions. We're not as old as the Union League Club, but we do have a significant anniversary this year. In December, the League of Women Voters of Chicago will be celebrating its centennial. Look for an invitation to a big celebration on December 2nd. The League of Women Voters of Chicago is a nonpartisan political organization encouraging informed and active participation in government, formed from the movement that secured the right to vote for women. The centerpiece of the League's efforts remains to expand political participation and give a voice to all Americans. We pursue these goals through voter services activities such as voter registration, information for voters, poll watching, and candidate debates and forums, and through education of its member, lobbying government on selected issues, and through observation of the functioning of government bodies to monitor their accountability and transparency. I will put in the chat a link to the Illinois Voter Guide, where you can pull up a copy of your ballot. And what I especially like about it is that you only see the judges that are going to be on your ballot, so you can research the ones you're going to see, but it also has how the 13 bar associations evaluated them. So I'll put that there. So our speaker this evening is Jake Braun. He is the Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Initiative in the University of Chicago.
There's some feedback over there, you guys.
Yeah, Jane, can you look at that? Jane, can you monitor participants and do the, thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, back to Jake. Jake Braun, he is the Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Initiative in the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, where he works at the Center of Politics, Technology, and National Security to advance the field of cyber policy. He is the author of the 2019 book, Democracy in Danger: How Hackers and Activists Exposed Fatal Flaws in the Election System, and has co-authored 2 award-winning and seminal works on election infrastructure cyber vulnerabilities. Mr. Braun is also Chief Executive Officer of Cambridge Global Advisors, which is a consulting firm with expertise and experience at the global, national, state, and local levels. Their mission is to assist clients in the development and implementation of their programs, practices, and policies with a special focus on national security. Before he joined the University of Chicago faculty and Cambridge Global Advisors, Mr. Braun served on the presidential transition team for the Obama administration as Deputy Director for the National Security Agency's Review. President Obama subsequently appointed Mr. Braun as White House liaison to the Department of Homeland Security, where he oversaw some of the most high-profile public engagements executed at the DHS. In addition, Mr. Braun is co-founder of the DEFCON Voting Machine Hacking Village. DEFCON is the largest hacker conference in the world, and in cooperation with them, he has co-authored 2 fundamental and critically acclaimed reports on election infrastructure cyber vulnerabilities. That's DEFCON 25 and 26 Voting Village reports. Please join us in welcoming Jake Braun. And I'm going to find you and unmute you.
He's unmuted.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's funny, I still can't, with these Zooms, like if I want to fix this collar, I always use the wrong side, no matter, what you do. But anyway, so thanks for having me, and thanks for your interest in this topic. I think it's obviously, critically important to, the foundation of our country and the, spread of democracy and all these, ideals that were born out of the Enlightenment that we've been trying to ensure spread across the world through democracy. As we all know, we have seen a backslide to authoritarianism in many parts of the world. And one of the key ways we fight against that is making sure our democracies are strong, and that the institutions that enable those democracies are strong. And so there were many of us that did a lot of thinking about this after 2016 to try and really understand, what threats do we actually face here in election security these days. And years ago, most people, when they thought of election security, they thought we were talking about, some corrupt alderman in Chicago who may have stuffed ballots, into a ballot box, or, the old saying of vote early and often, or, those types of things. No one really thought that there were nation states that would, attack our democracy, through cyber attacks or other means like that. Propaganda, sure. I mean, that had been going on forever, but nation state attacks on our democratic infrastructure was kind of unheard of. And there was actually a recent story out in the public domain showing that the NSA, so our top spies, specifically those who look at cyber attacks and so on, read about the attacks in 2016 on CNN, and they had no idea they were coming because they weren't on anybody's radar at all. And so as we kind of started thinking about this, many of us came up or realized that we were dealing with a threat landscape that was far different than any of us really anticipated or thought that we were dealing with in advance of this. And so, from what you've read and seen on TV and so on, you may have heard about machines being hacked or the voter registration databases being scanned or hacked or whatever. I'm sure you've heard about all the disinformation out there on social media and so on and so forth. But what we've found is that there's kind of a continuum that is relatively predictable, and that unfortunately the attackers or the would-be attackers of our democracy can kind of depend on many aspects of our elections kind of failing us, that they can kind of then capitalize on. Here, I'm going to actually shut these blinds so you don't have to watch my wife making what, if you were here, you would realize smells like an incredibly good dinner. There's kind of four key aspects of this. Number one is our election infrastructure is deeply flawed and kind of prone to break. I certainly don't blame the election officials for it. And frankly, I don't really blame the vendors in many cases. The vendors are responding to the solicitations that are put out there for them that are essentially to build low-cost equipment that'll count votes. Well, you use this low-cost equipment for 10 years and it's going to break often. And so I'm going to go through some examples. But I want to highlight to folks that all these examples that I'm using are ones that come from this year, the 2020 election cycle. So these aren't things that happened in 2016 that might happen again, or things that we're imagining could happen in the future. These are things that have happened in the 2020 election cycle. So thing one is, or example number one is the Iowa app. So, this app was created for a mere $60,000. It was, just a regular app like you'd have on your phone that people were supposed to put their, or the precinct captains were supposed to put their results in for each precinct on caucus night. And the app crashed. Now the party swears the app wasn't hacked, so we'll take them at their word. But the app crashed, which it's kind of astounding to me that in probably the most consequential election we had in 4 years, which is the first nominating contest of the 2020 election cycle, the entire reporting process was largely, at least initially, dependent upon an app that was slapped together pretty quickly, not tested much, and had very little money spent to build it. By the way, just in a way of comparison, DARPA, the main research agency for the Pentagon, spent $30 million to build a similar type of voting equipment that it wanted to try and make sure it was secure. So that's the kind of order of magnitude bigger you would need to actually spend what you need to make something like that secure. Another example is these electronic poll books that you may have seen kind of breaking down across the country. Georgia's the best example. The vendor, of course, there's a couple main vendors who produce these. They say, well, it wasn't the poll book that broke. It's that the poll workers were kind of poorly trained, not very technical. A lot of them were senior citizens, et cetera, et cetera. And, as technologists, our view of this is, well, hold on. You knew going into this that your user base are the people who've been administering these elections for forever, which are volunteers who aren't technical, oftentimes are seniors, and certainly often show up the day of, or maybe they get a couple-hour training a few days before. But if your poll book or technology requires some computer science department head to run it, well, then that's a flaw with your technology. That's not a flaw with the poll worker. They're kind of a constant in this equation. You're the one introducing new technology. And so that's why you saw, 6, 7, 8 hour long lines in Georgia, and we've seen this across the country. So, again, this is a thing where those poll books, to the best of our knowledge, like the app in Iowa, wasn't hacked. It just fails us. It breaks. It doesn't work when it's supposed to. And again, the attackers can bet on this. They now have studied this enough that they know that these things are going to happen. And then the final example I'll give you of this is the voter registration databases, which we know have already been hacked this cycle. And the flaw here is that, and I can tell you this because this is public information from 2016, although I'll get into later the attacks that have happened on them this cycle, is that despite election officials telling us repeatedly since 2016 that a foreign adversary, or anybody else for that matter, can't hack these voter registration databases from the internet because they're not attached to the internet. It turns out that the way the Russians got into the voter registration databases in 2016, and the way Russian criminals seem to have gotten into them this cycle with ransomware attacks, is by hacking the websites of the election officials or election departments, whether it be at the county or state level. And obviously, if the way they got to the database was by hacking the website and getting into the system, well, then somehow that database is connected to something that's connected to the internet. Even if it's not consistently connected, it's at least intermittently connected to something that's connected to the internet. Okay, so thing one, that kind of none of the people who deal with national security thought of before 2016, or really until probably a year or two after, is that the technology stack we're dealing with here is deeply flawed and is gonna break. Something is gonna break every election cycle. And again, we've already seen multiple examples of it this time. Okay, so then secondly, what do the attackers do? Well, the attackers have now realized that it's relatively easy for them to step in and administer what often turn out to be low grade, but what's important is largely unattributable attacks on these systems. And let me give you probably the lowest tech but most unattributable one that I can lay out as an example from, again, this cycle in 2020. So we go back to Iowa on caucus night. So, you know, part of the reason that they allowed this app to be used to report the results was everybody said to the Iowa Democratic Party, okay, well, what's the backup if the app crashes? It's not like everyone there was an idiot who didn't think that, gee, the app might crash, because we all have apps on our phones that crash all the time. And they said, well, don't worry, we've got the same backup. That's what we've been using for decades, which is people will just pick up the phone and they'll call in the results to the Iowa Democratic Party, and then they'll put it in their spreadsheet or whatever they do. Turns out that, I don't know if many of you read about this, we didn't know about it until days or maybe weeks after the election or the caucus. But on a thing called 4chan, which I'm dramatically oversimplifying it here, but it's essentially Twitter for bad guys. On 4chan, some group, and again, we don't know who, still to this day, to my knowledge, no one knows who, posted on the site, hey, everybody, here's the kind of first nominating or first election of 2020. Here's the times in which they're going to be calling in their results. Here's all the phone numbers at the Iowa Democratic Party call center. Wouldn't it be great if you all just called in and jammed their phone lines? By the way, if you get through, give them fake election results. I'm paraphrasing, of course, what they said. I don't know if they were as glib or sarcastic as I just was. And so, lo and behold, anybody who tried to call in, and I know because I had lots of friends and staff who were there, I was involved in it, spent hours sitting on the phone trying to get through to Iowa Democratic Party headquarters. And it was so bad that they actually had to call the Democratic National Committee and ask to roll calls into the Democratic National Committee call center, which had dozens more phone lines, so that they could take election results. And those lines were even jammed. So the wait was still hours and hours and hours to get the election results in. And we all know what came from that. It was days of us not knowing what the results were, and all chaos ensuing in the media and so on. And that, my friends, is a hack, right? Nobody went through and typed ones and zeros and took down their system, but by using the system against itself, by, you know, there's only a few phone numbers you need to call. I can just put this out there and I'll get thousands of people to call, and it'll jam the lines. They were able to, you know, really, I mean, you know, take down the system, so much so that, as many of you know, the chair of the Iowa Democratic Party had to resign after all this. And it was, I believe, 3 days before they actually had the definitive results. And the way they got them was they had to send people around to go pick up the actual paper, piece of paper that the precinct worker had written the results down on. So, okay, so that's one example of these, like, really low tech in this case, but completely unattributable attacks. Still to this day, to my knowledge, we don't know who posted those posts on 4chan. And by the way, all across the country, election jurisdictions report their results in on similar types of apps. Now, many of them are more secure than what was being used in Iowa. Many of them are not as public facing, and so on and so forth. But, you know, an app is an app is an app. If one wanted to hack it or take it down or whatever, that could be done. So we are still very susceptible to a problem like this. Secondly, one of the things that we know, or another one of these kind of low cost, unattributable attacks that was set up, was done right here in Illinois. So many of you may have seen an NBC report right before the primary, or maybe it was right after, that showed that the Cook County Board of Elections had a fake Facebook page put up that looked exactly like the official Facebook page of the County Board of Elections. And we don't actually know what the would-be attacker was going to do with that. But we do know, because the county caught it and got Google or Facebook to take it down right before the election. But we do know that in the Ukraine in 2014, a very similar thing was done where a website was put up to look just like the official government website that announced election results. And what they did was they put all types of misinformation on there and altered the results to show that the candidate who had won had actually not won and that a different candidate had won. And then we believe the Russians were behind this because right after that, Russian media started announcing that their preferred candidate had won when in fact the candidate had not. And so again, this is not something that just happened in the Ukraine in 2014. This is not the type of thing that is just in my dystopian mind that could happen someday. But some organization, again, we don't know who because it's unattributable, has created at least one fake but very official looking election website based on a real government board of elections, in this case, Cook County. And by the way, as a side note on that, at DEF CON, this hacker conference that I've been working with for the last several years to identify these vulnerabilities and make them known to especially vendors and election officials, but also the public so they can honestly pressure election officials and others to fix these things. We created fake websites similar to what was done here and what the Russians did before to look exactly like battleground state Secretary of State websites that announce the results and so on. So Florida, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, blah, blah. So we went in, looked at the websites, created ones that looked exactly like them, and so on, and took the, set these up at the conference. And in talking to some of the real hackers in advance, they said to us, don't do this. It's so easy to hack. Like the real hackers aren't going to want to waste their time with it. And so we were like, all right, well, what do we do? How do we kind of show this vulnerability? And so somebody's like, well, why don't you have the little kids do it? So there's a division of the conference for children to like teach white hat hacking and get kids involved and interested in technology. So we set it up in this room for kids 18 years old and younger. And two kids, a boy and a girl, 11 years old, were able to hack into the websites and change the election results around in 10 minutes. And by the way, as you can imagine, many of the election officials were very mad at us for doing this. And they said, how could you do this? We have better security than that. That's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And we kind of had to accept what they were saying because we don't know what security they have on their websites. And we had the kids use like really one of the most simple hacks. It's called a SQL injection, SQL injection, to attack the website and then change the tallies around. Well, it turns out the Mueller report comes out about 4 or 5 months after the conference. And in the Mueller report on page 50, you can look this up. I've had to cite it so many times for the press, I've memorized the page. On page 50 of the Mueller report, it says that when the Russians hacked into the voter registration databases, they hacked into the websites to get there. And what type of attack did they use? A SQL injection, just like the kids used. So in fact, actually, the Russians didn't do anything more sophisticated than an 11-year-old boy and girl were able to do in 10 minutes. And they were actually able to access all the voter records and so on. It wasn't something as simple as changing the face of the website around. Okay, so unattributable attacks, number 2. Third one, most disconcerting, I'll get back to this later, but I just want to mention it, is these ransomware attacks where an entity, and in this case, what's been reported in the New York Times and elsewhere, is that Russian criminal organizations, which anybody who follows Russia knows that there's not a lot of distance between the criminal organizations and their intelligence services. And oftentimes the intelligence services pay the criminal organizations to do what needs to be done. Have been sending out ransomware attacks all over the world. And just by happenstance, many of them seem to be attacking voter registration databases here in the United States. It's happened in Texas and in several different counties, as well as other places. And what it does is the malware, I call it, goes in and locks down the database so that no one can access it unless they pay a fine or whatever, or pay a fee to the attacker. However, it turns out that in many of these cases, even if you offer to pay, they won't unlock the data, which makes you wonder, are they incompetent crooks, or are they in league with the government and are doing this for political reasons and just don't want to unlock the data? this could cause an enormous amount of chaos if it were to be widespread here in the next week or so. Because if we were to lock down, let's say, Detroit's voter registration database, or the state of Michigan's, for example, or the city of Philadelphia, we wouldn't know who was sent a ballot, who returned a ballot, whose ballot was counted, whether their tally was put in the overall tally. It would be total chaos. And again, these ransomware attacks have already happened on voter registration databases this cycle. We know Russian criminal, or we are told Russian criminal organizations are behind it. But again, in terms of attribution, we don't know. Is that the Russian government? Is that, just criminals? We have no idea. Okay, so thing one, flawed infrastructure. Thing two, low cost, unattributable attacks. Thing three, and again, this is something we do to ourselves, just like the flawed infrastructure that'll break, is we have public outcry on traditional and social media, and our own homegrown conspiracy theories. So as we saw with Iowa, as we saw with Georgia, the other examples I gave, there's an enormous amount of public outcry. The media and social media just pounce, and it's days or weeks, if we all remember Florida 2000, of just nonstop 24/7 coverage of, oh my God, how bad is this? Is so bad. What's happening? Democracy is going to end and everything else. On top of that, you have these conspiracy theories that get spun up from the fringes. Well, years back, conspiracy theory could happen. There could be some crazy guy out in a cabin in the woods who thinks that, Martians did it or whatever. And fine, it's him and, his 4 neighbors who are going to hear that, and that's it. Well, now that guy's got a Facebook page and a Twitter account. And even that is probably okay, because I bet that guy only has a few dozen followers, right? Well, again, this now, again, is where the fourth part of our threat landscape comes in. So if the first part is the flawed infrastructure that's going to break, something's going to break. The next part is these low-cost, unattributable attacks. The third part the attacker can count on is our own media and fringes of our society are going to go bonkers about these problems and come up with conspiracy theories. And then the trolls and bots come in for the fourth part, and they find the posts and tweets of this guy in a cabin out in the woods, and they make it so not just a few dozen or a few hundred of his followers see it, but they have hundreds of thousands of tweets and retweets and posts and reposts and so on. So it's popping up in your feed, and it now seems normal. And it now seems like this is an acceptable, meme that you're seeing, or theory out there as to what happened. And here's my question to you on this hypothetical, and we'll get to questions in a second, is what department do you give that to? Right? Does DOD do that? Does Homeland Security do that? Does the CIA deal with that? Is it the FEC and a telecommunications issue? I mean, I don't know. And by the way, neither does anybody else. And that's the problem with this threat landscape. If you look at it through this far broader lens, if it's just, voting machines we can't count on and voting infrastructure, okay, like that's a problem we can solve with some money and regulations and so on. If it's, hackers that we could go identify and find them, okay, that's what NSA and Cybercom do, is they go find those folks and deal with them. If it was public outrage and so on and so forth, okay, harder to deal with. However, we've got a bunch of great groups like the League of Women Voters who try and be reasonable voices in society and can help deal with some of those things. And if it was just crazy tweets and posts, okay, again, maybe not in 2016, but Facebook and Twitter, have set up situations where you can go and get them to take things down. But all that together, dealing with it in, maybe a 48-hour time frame as it all goes kind of bonkers on us, is, no one knows who to pick up the phone and call about that. And that's a problem for us. So let me just quickly, and then I'll stop yammering on and go to questions or comments for that matter. So you may have seen in the news last week that there's kind of multiple reports here. One is that the Iranians have some voter registration data that they got somehow. Maybe they hacked a voter registration database. Maybe they just got it on the dark web, so to speak, whatever. And they're sending these, according to the Proud Boys, this far right-wing group, fake videos to Democrats saying, don't vote or we're going to come after you and all this other salacious stuff. So first of all, if that's true and Iran is doing that, that's deeply disconcerting because, as I said, it was unthinkable that a nation state would attack our democratic infrastructure before 2016, so much so that NSA found out about it on CNN because they weren't even, it wasn't even on the radar. If we now have another player who's involved, and now Russia and our response, in my view, has made this seem like it's an acceptable type of activity to engage in, or one that has little consequences behind it, that's very disconcerting. That being said, you know, the attribution to Iran was made incredibly quickly after the videos were found. This data is not hard to come by in terms of, you know, if we want to target Democrats in Florida, where supposedly many of these videos were put out in, any of us right now could go online and buy a list of email addresses totally legally and for a small amount of money of people who live in Miami, of which 85% are likely going to be Democrats, and send them a bunch of mean videos and emails. We wouldn't need to hack a voter registration database or go on the dark web for that. So how exactly they've come to Iran as the culprit here, we're not sure, but you know, it certainly is possible that they were the ones who did this. And again, if they are, it's deeply disconcerting. Secondly, with Russia, there's two pieces to this. A, if you looked at the news reports and at the news conference that the FBI director put out, or not FBI, the guy who was the head of the spoke at the news conference, Russia was kind of an afterthought. It was like, well, Iran has this data and they're sending these terrible emails that are fake Proud Boy emails. Oh, and by the way, we think Russia has some of this data too. And we think Russia's doing bad stuff too. So it's like Iran. Oh, by the way, Russia. And which of course, for many of us who have been far more concerned about Russia, who's way more sophisticated than the Iranians on this stuff, and who ran a pretty sophisticated series of attacks against us in 2016, we're kind of like, okay, well, wait a second. So what are you saying Russia did or did not do or whatever? And we've gotten very little information out about that. And again, I don't want to be one of these conspiracy theorists either, but at the very same time, Homeland Security is releasing kind of what seems to me a little late in the game, because they just released them last week, and kind of frantically, it seems, a bunch of what they call CVEs, which are vulnerabilities that we know have been exploited or can be exploited by bad guys, and saying to election officials, here's these vulnerabilities out here. They've been exploited by somebody at some point. We think you guys have them on your system. In many cases on their website, by the way, which we know the Russians attacked in 2016. So please fix them. And so there's been a couple announcements of these vulnerabilities that have gotten very little press. They were mentioned in a few stories. The first Washington Post story on this mentioned 4 paragraphs down that, oh, by the way, DHS also mentioned that there's holes in the websites of these state and locals that need to be fixed, which of course got my antennae up, because that's how the Russians got to the databases last time. I think there's a lot that we're really concerned about. What's going on with these vulnerabilities? Why are we worried about these vulnerabilities right now as opposed to others? What exactly is Russia up to? Why are they being mentioned in these stories? And what's most disconcerting, and I'll spend 30 seconds on this and then be done, is who's going to go fix these vulnerabilities at the local level? Now, we're really lucky in Chicago and Cook County, and frankly, DuPage and Lake for that matter. These are relatively well-funded counties. They have budgets the size that they can hire cyber professionals or at least cybersecurity vendors. But if you're out in Allen-McKee County, Iowa, which is a lovely place, but it's got 10,000 people there, and they will never hire the head of cybersecurity in Allen-McKee County because they don't have the budget, and there's nobody to hire that can do this stuff. And remember, there's 8,000 jurisdictions in the country, and outside of the top 100 that have a cyber professional who can fix these vulnerabilities, DHS just announced last week, the other 7,900 of them are going to have these vulnerabilities go unfixed. and that's deeply concerning to me. So at University of Chicago, we've actually stood up a pro bono group of cyber experts that are offering free help to local election jurisdictions to do things like this, to actually secure, make their systems more secure and do things like fix these CVEs, these vulnerabilities at the 11th hour like we are now. So I've gone on for a while. Let me pause here, and I'm happy to take questions or comments, or you can also tell me I'm crazy if you want. Whatever you guys want to talk about.
Gosh, you're making us, we weren't jittery before, and we're so much less jittery now. If you all want to put your questions in the chat, I think we have one already. I thought I'd start with a question, which is kind of a big question, really. When I think about the vulnerability, because in Illinois, we just sent out all these things to election officials about voting rights for people, for detainees, and so there's over 100 in just Illinois, and then you multiply that. Is there security in that? I mean, because everyone keeps saying, oh, we need one system, we need to get all together. It's sort of like, I think of a chain of pearls, and each one's knotted, you break it and they don't all fall at once. So could you weigh that a little bit for me?
So the one system versus the disaggregated system we have now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can kind of have your cake and eat it too a little bit. I mean, there are federal standards that we could certainly put in place that are far more exhaustive than what we have now. Mandating certain types of security. There's components of the infrastructure that could be in maybe not like one cloud, for example, but multiple clouds, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, whatever, where those guys and gals do have the resources to actually secure the data far better than any local jurisdiction ever could. Granted, it's not like those clouds aren't hackable. They certainly are. Anything is hackable. But they have far more resources to secure the data. I would also argue that the software that all these systems run on is really old. It's kind of a black box, and we could create open source data. In fact, there's a lot of technologists working on developing it now. Open source data that the good guys can look at and find flaws in. Our problem right now is that we've got 4 big vendors, and we can be certain that the Russians have hacked into their, and whoever else wants to, has hacked into their networks to look at their software and see how it works. Our problem is the good guys aren't looking at their software to see how it works. And if we made the software open source, we could have the good guys looking at it too. So we could do a couple things like that, where we had some software that, yes, was maybe uniform, but you had thousands of white hat hackers looking at it too, not just the bad guys. Voter registration databases in multiple different clouds, and then let the jurisdictions kind of administer things as they want from there. So they can use different types of machines, they could use different voting procedures, and so on and so forth, and still have a disaggregated aspect to it, but also have some sort of benchline security measures and some backbone technology that they could just never create or purchase themselves.
Okay. I think we have a couple questions. Let me, Julia has a question, and she's wondering if it's not Iran, who do you suppose is behind this hack sent by the Proud Boys? Did you want to speculate on that a little bit for us?
So I don't know. I don't know, and I wouldn't pretend to know. I think what's more disconcerting to me was how did they come to this attribution so incredibly quickly? When again, I mean, I gave multiple examples where how hard attribution is to do for any of these things, like the other attacks. And was it was it potentially a way for them to kind of, get the information out about Russia that they needed to, and then these vulnerabilities on the state and local systems, but not have to talk about that too much and be able to talk about this Proud Boys thing. So I guess I'm more worried about that than wondering whether it happened to be, I don't know, the Chinese or some other right-wing group that was impersonating the Proud Boys or somebody.
That makes sense. We have two questions that are very similar. You said there's nobody to call in your hypothetical question to us. Do you personally have ideas about who we should empower to be the person, quote unquote, to call? And Sharon is asking the role of journalists in this concerted efforts by journalists and schools of journalism to establish basic practices to stop this. For example, is the University of Chicago working with the School of Journalism at Northwestern on this? So that's kind of a two-part question, I guess.
Sure. Well, why don't I go in reverse? So I know that at Harris, and so I'm not involved in what we're doing in journalism because I do the cyber stuff, but I do know that there's a big program that they're working on journalism in this respect of responsible journalism and also how they're kind of getting to the bottom of some of these types of issues. I don't think it's actually been rolled out yet, and I forget. They're working with one of the major publishers or whatever on it. I'd love to find out that they're working with Northwestern too, because they have such a great journalism school there. But I just don't know. I think that I would say there's two things about journalism that are really important here. One is, and I think we're seeing a correction on this where in 16, I think the press in many ways was almost dismissive about the Russia stuff. It didn't seem like they were really digging into it as much as many of these reporters are now. I mean, you say ransomware now, and these reporters are, all down these rabbit holes on it. That wasn't the case in 16. So I feel like they've corrected that way. What I'm a little bit worried about is that while you don't want to be hyperbolic, many of the parties, I would say on the left, and look, anybody who Googles me I wear my political stripes on my sleeve, so I feel like I'm allowed to speak about the left because I am a dying-the-wool Democrat. But I think the left is in many ways is saying, oh God, don't talk about this stuff right now because it looks like he's going to win, and we don't want to scare people away from voting, and we don't want to give Trump an excuse to call the election into question. Mm-hmm. I certainly understand that logic. However, there is no actual evidence that I've ever seen that shows that saying to people, your vote might be in jeopardy, actually stops them from voting. And quite to the contrary, if you look at Georgia in 2018, everybody said over and over, your vote is in jeopardy, and people turned out in droves. Now, as somebody who works at a very serious academic institution, I can't point to like some very rigorous study that shows that is the case, but it is certainly not a foregone conclusion that if we say your vote might be in jeopardy, people don't vote. And secondly, with this idea that if we do talk about these problems, it's going to give Trump or whoever wants to steal an election. It could be Erdogan in Turkey, and down the road, or pick your person. That you're just kind of feeding the fire, or feeding their strategy. I think once you decide that you're not going to report on reality and the truth and so on and so forth, you kind of wind up in a very weird, slippery slope that I don't think is long-term the right direction that we want journalism, or democracy going. I think it may be painful at times and it may have short-term difficult consequences, but I think voters and policymakers and so on need to know what's really happening out there. So anyway, that's my answer on the journalism part. On the who do you call part, Um, you know, after a couple of years of the Trump administration, they got rid of the White House cyber coordinator. Um, you know, I don't think that that's the guy or gal you pick up the phone and call, but I think that person or that office could run a interagency, program that brings in all these different agencies and has them have the right people involved, so that they can start to think about these issues not from their narrow piece of it, but as a whole, and then figure out how to tackle it, and also how to have uh, operations in place that can respond appropriately to deal with a broad swath of problems at once, as opposed to just their narrowly pinpointed things. So I would start with reinstating that White House cyber coordinator.
Mhm. Would you bring in people from social media as well? Twitter, Facebook, to take care of that other side?
Without question. I mean, I think through, you'd have to have folks from the private sector involved because they control the infrastructure.
Right.
Microsoft too, even because Microsoft is kind of the guts of so much of not only the machines, but also the networks and the databases and so on. That for the infrastructure security side, you'd want Microsoft to pull. And on the social media side, yeah, to your point, I mean, you have to have Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and all those folks there. And part of the way you can do that is A, by just, pressuring them to do it, which I think most of them would agree to. And B, the FEC and others can, help compel their participation if need be.
That makes sense. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about DEF CON Hackers Village. Could you give us a couple more stories from that? And did something come out of that really has changed how we're boards of elections across the country are working? That together with this new program where you have all these volunteers who are actually going in and helping. Are those two things coming together? Things that were found are getting fixed? Is it seamless along with the DHS? I don't know whether it was CVS or something that they got. Is this all coming together, and are you feeling good about it?
Well, I think on your question about DEF CON and actual impact it's had. So, I mean, the answer is emphatically yes. I mean, one of my favorite stories from DEF CON is, so there's a bunch of people who've been in kind of the voting, not like the voting security community, but security like tech security side, cybersecurity. We've been doing this for a while, and they were really worried initially about us doing this because they were like, well, what if nobody can hack the machines? They're like, we've had academics who've spent days and weeks, working on trying to hack the machines and so on and so forth, and it can be really difficult. And we were really kind of worried because we knew that the machines were vulnerable. But we were like, well, what if they can't get in? All it's going to do is reinforce what so many in the industry had been saying after 2016, that, oh, don't worry about it, everything's secure and it's air gapped and blah, blah, blah. And so, the first morning of the conference, so I was running a speakers track in a separate room from where we had a bunch of folks getting ready to hack into the machines. And so they opened the door and did a quick tutorial. Here's the types of machines we have, blah, blah, blah. As I'm like introducing our speakers. And before I even get to the first speaker, one of the guys, one of my co-founders comes, Hari Hursty, who's actually the kind of key figure in the HBO documentary that's out called Zero Day, I think. It's about all the election security stuff. Anyway, he comes running in and is like, oh my God, they already got in the first machine. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, they already hacked in. I'm like, well, how long have they been at it? Because they had opened their doors. He's like, 2 minutes. They've had access to the machines for 2 minutes. and he got in remotely. He wasn't even touching the machine, and he was able to totally take it over, delete votes, add votes, change votes, whatever you want. And that machine actually, within, I think, a few months after the conference, was completely removed from the state of Virginia, which is where it was in use. And it was going to be phased out in the future at some point, but there were multiple elections that it was then not used in because we were able to hack it so easily at DEF CON. And the remote part was particularly disconcerting. So that's thing one. Thing two is, many of you may have seen there's this huge court battle in Georgia to get rid of the machines they had, because they were these direct recording machines where you vote on you touch the screen, you vote, and the machine on some sort of a cartridge records your vote. And so there's no paper ballot to go back to and audit or whatever. And we had those machines as well at DEF CON. In fact, by the way, the machines we have, over 70% of the United States votes on one of the machines we have at DEF CON. And you'll hear from the vendors, oh, they're old machines. And it's like, many of them are old. However, that's what's in use in these precincts today. And by the way, the newer models we've gotten, we've been able to hack into as well. But anyway, so in the court battle, to get rid of those machines in Georgia and get these new paper options in place, they cited DEF CON testimony and actually had multiple of my colleagues at DEF CON testify and about how the machines were so insecure they had to be taken out of circulation, and thus were. The lawsuits won there. And then separately, and again, we'll see what happens in November, but if you look at House Bill 1, that how the House Homeland Security Committee has put together to revamp our election infrastructure, there's two provisions in there that come, I wouldn't say directly from us, but we helped influence. One, which is to provide significant money, like in the hundreds of millions category, to R&D for new election equipment, because again, to the point that ours is old and is unreliable. We believe that since this is a national security problem, we really do need federal dollars to go into R&D, because the vendors, their margins are really thin. They'll never have the money to put into real R&D. Not their fault. It's just how the industry works. And then secondly, a bug bounty program where hackers are actually incentivized in a legal way and so on and so forth to go in and find vulnerabilities in partnership with election offices and so on, and then we'll get paid if they find exploits or vulnerabilities and so on. And so both of those things are written into this bill, which again, depending on what happens in the election, would have a likelihood of passing, depending on who's in control of the House and Senate.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Julia, do you want to just ask your question yourself? I could read it. You've typed it out here.
Yeah, I can ask.
Okay.
So, hi, thank you for joining us. So yeah, I don't, a lot of what you talked about tonight, my question is, to what extent there is a place for citizen action with any of this? I mean, obviously some of what you've talked about, there's no relevance, but there are a number of us on this call who have joined this kind of coalition of organizations that are engaging around protect the results. And we're calling ourselves Truth Brigade. And essentially, in broad terms, the mission is to scour the internet looking for disinformation and then report it. And you've got me wondering who we're reporting it to, but leaving that aside. And then also putting out information that is intended to counter disinformation. We do a weekly Twitter storm that gets, between 2 and 3 million impressions every week. And we do kind of pat ourselves on the back that some of the terrific turnout in early voting for Illinois is due to our efforts. So we do think we have the capacity to be impactful. And so, long-winded way of asking the question, given that that's what we're doing, is there anything that you can think like, hey, as long as we've got a bunch of volunteers getting ready to tweet a bunch of stuff out or do some stuff, this is what you folks should be focusing on? Do you have anything like the equivalent of the indivisible guide, congressmen saying, hey, people, don't do things that don't work. Here's what does work.
Yes, for sure. I'm sorry, was it?
No, that was my phone thought that I was talking to it. I don't know.
It was talking back. Yes,
Yeah.
I know. I had this woman on my staff named Alexa.
Yeah.
It was so frustrating when I was on the phone because it was always like, talking back to me. I'm sure every person named Alexa in the country wants to sue Google right now. But anyway, or Amazon. Yeah, so a few things. Thing one, in many parts of the country, you have a choice as to whether you vote on a hand-marked paper ballot you mark yourself, or a different ballot. And in Illinois, by the way, we do have these ballot marking devices. And I think encouraging people where they have the option to vote on a paper ballot that they mark with their own hand is useful, because if we wind up in a scenario where we've got to go back and count all these things because, there is a problem, maybe one of the races is really close, there's an attack, there's other irregularities, who knows what. If you've got a ballot that again, you've marked with your own hand, we can go back and count these things. That's obviously far better than one where it gives you, remember what we used to have here where you'd have it look like a receipt that it told you voted. Those are disconcerting, but even these new ballot marking devices are okay, but it turns out that 94% of the people who make mistakes on them don't catch their mistakes. And the fact that it's a machine means that it's susceptible to attack and so on. So to the extent a voter has the opportunity to get handed a paper ballot and hand mark that ballot themselves, I would encourage them to do that. Again, I mean, I think you can say that in a way that's not inflammatory, so that people aren't, refusing to vote where there's a ballot marking device. But if they have the option, they should take that. So I think, that's thing one. Thing two is, where we see, well, I guess let me back up. In most parts of Illinois, well, let me ask, are you talking about Illinois specifically or nationally?
I think that we're a nationwide effort, but most of us are. I mean, I suppose you can answer the question both, and I would say Illinois and even Chicago, because of course the Chicago election authority is separate from the Illinois election authority. So to whatever extent you want to answer the question, I suppose.
Okay, so nationally speaking, Catherine and I were just talking about this before the call. The number one thing that disenfranchises voters every cycle, before there were Russian hacking or any of this Proud Boys or anything else, was long lines. And so much so that, our analysis has shown, or analysis that I did on the Obama campaign and then also in academia, has shown that it's possible we lose hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, or up to 1 million votes nationwide a year, or at least in the presidential years. And a lot of those are in major urban areas. We're fortunate in the fact that it's not that big of a problem in Chicago, although it can be, but in places like Detroit, Columbus, Milwaukee, Miami, and so on and so forth, it is a huge problem. And part of it is that these clerks often just feel like this has to be a fact of life when it doesn't. And if they were to apportion their assets appropriately, they wouldn't have the lines. And part of the problem they don't is there's not enough public pressure on them saying, hey, what are you going to do to make sure there's not long lines? By the way, and I can send you guys a link to this afterwards. MIT has a tracking system that, by the way, most clerks in the country now, new ones, are trained to use to help them apportion their assets so that they don't have long lines. It's a very simple thing to use. It's publicly available, doesn't cost them a dime. And I think, tweeting or posting or having folks in those places call their clerk and say, hey, are you using this to ensure we're not going to have long lines? What is your long line plan? Is a totally reasonable request. And again, it is considered best practice in their industry to use this MIT online tool to understand how best to deploy their assets. And again, I can send that to you guys afterwards.
Is it, I think I have it and can put it in the chat. Hold on. If I could just get control. Is it VTP? It's,
Yep.
okay. I just put it in. I just put the URL in the chat. Right. Well, we've actually gone over our time at this point. I think this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. And if we're all in a room together, you would get a huge round of applause right about now.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. This has been very informative.
Well, thanks. And I hope that someday soon we're all at the Union League Club having a cocktail and an enjoyable in-person conversation.
And looking at those beautiful paintings. The Union League Club is a gorgeous place. I miss it.
It is. My wife works at the EPA, so she's right next door. I've been there a bunch of times. It's a beautiful place.
It is. It is.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Just fantastic.
All right. Good luck and thanks for everything you're doing between now and the election and everything you do in advance of the election.
And thanks for everything you're doing as well.
Yeah, thank you.
You.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.